The house had never felt so quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that comforted you, it was the kind that reminded you how big the world really was when you were suddenly left alone inside it. Emma stood by the window, watching her parents' car disappear down the long, wet driveway. The sound of the engine faded, swallowed by the soft murmur of falling rain. A moment later, the only thing left was the ticking of the kitchen clock and the slow drip of water from the eaves outside. She didn't move for a while. She just stood there, holding her mug of tea, staring at the empty street. Her parents were only gone for the weekend. They'd gone to visit her aunt in another town, something they did every few months, but this time felt different. Maybe it was because she was 23 now, no longer the teenager who needed reminders to lock the doors or feed the cat. Maybe it was because she'd been feeling lost lately, unsure where her life was really heading, or maybe, deep down, she knew this quiet weekend would change something in her. Emma's life had become a routine, rhythm of safe, predictable choices. She worked remotely as a freelance illustrator, spent her mornings sketching by the window, and her evenings scrolling through other people's stories online. She had friends, but they were busy. She had dreams, but they were buried under hesitation and maybe later. Her parents loved her, but even love could start to feel like distance when you couldn't quite explain the emptiness you felt inside. Sometimes she'd lie awake at night, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and thinking about how strange it was to be surrounded by so much and still feel like something was missing. That was her unspoken truth. An ache that wasn't painful, just constant. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking the windows like watercolor lines. She turned away from the glass and wandered into the living room. Every object had a story: her father's favorite chair, her mother's porcelain lamp, the bookshelf that still smelled faintly of pine. She ran her fingers across the spines of books, remembering the stories she used to get lost in, stories about adventure, friendship, and love that felt both impossible and inevitable. Now, she realized she hadn't read for pleasure in months. Her mind had been too full of bills, deadlines, and that quiet feeling that her life was waiting for something to begin. She picked up an old photo frame from the side table. Picture of her family taken 5 years ago. Everyone was smiling. Back then, she'd believed she'd have it all figured out by now. Her career, her heart, her path. But here she was, still searching. As she set the frame down, her phone buzzed on the counter. A message flashed on the screen. "Daniel? Hey, your parents left already?" A small smile tugged at her lips. Daniel had been her neighbor for as long as she could remember. He was the kind of person who noticed things the first to shovel the snow off her parents' driveway in winter, the first to wave when she drove by. They'd grown up together, though life had taken them in different directions. He was now a high school teacher at the local school, always patient, always kind. Their conversations these days were brief, small check-ins about life, work, the weather. Still, every time his name appeared on her screen, something in her heart lifted, even if she couldn't explain why. She typed back, "Yeah, just me and the house tonight." His reply came almost instantly. "Lucky you. I'd trade grading papers for peace and quiet any day." She laughed quietly and sent back a simple emoji. The conversation ended there. But the warmth lingered longer than she expected as the evening deepened. The rain began to fall harder, drumming softly on the roof. Emma lit a candle, even though the lights were still on, just to make the house feel less empty. The golden flicker danced across the walls, painting familiar corners in a softer light. She sat on the couch, her sketchbook open on her lap. But instead of drawing, she stared at the blank page. For some reason, her thoughts drifted not to work, not to deadlines, but to the way Daniel had smiled last week when she helped him carry groceries from his car. It had been nothing special, just a small, friendly moment. But the memory had stayed with her. She sighed, shaking her head lightly. "Get it together, Emma," she murmured. The thunder rolled softly outside, like a whisper of something waiting. Then, just as she leaned back, the power flickered once, twice. Then the lights went out completely. For a second, She just sat there in the dim candlelight, listening to the sudden stillness. The hum of the refrigerator was gone. The heater stopped. The only sound left was the rain and her own heartbeat. She stood up, walking slowly toward the window. The neighborhood was wrapped in darkness, except for a few scattered lights from houses down the street. And there, through the misty rain, she saw him, Daniel, standing on his porch, holding a flashlight. He looked over, saw her window glowing faintly with candlelight, and raised a hand in greeting. Emma felt her lips curve into a small, genuine smile. She lifted her hand back, a silent acknowledgement that neither of them was really alone in the storm. Maybe that was how change began. Not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but with quiet recognition between two people who happened to look up at the same time. She didn't know it yet, but that night would stay with her long after the rain stopped, and as she stood there in the soft candlelight, her heart whispered a thought she didn't dare say aloud. What really happens when parents aren't home might just be the start of something I've been waiting for all along. Part 2. The past and connection. The rain didn't stop that night. It softened, then grew strong again, like it couldn't decide whether to leave or stay. Emma stood by the window long after Daniel had gone back inside, watching the faint glow from his porch light shimmer across the puddles. Something about that small light made her feel comforted. It was strange, really, how one familiar face across the street could make the dark feel less lonely. As she turned away from the window, her eyes fell on an old photo album sitting on the bookshelf. It was tucked between cookbooks and dusty magazines, almost forgotten. She pulled it out and carried it to the couch, setting it gently beside the candle's glow. The cover was worn, the corners bent from years of being opened and closed. When she flipped it open, she smiled without meaning to. There they were, two children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting side by side on the grass. Daniel had a wide, toothy grin. Emma's hair was tangled from the wind, her eyes squinting in laughter. Behind them stood her parents, smiling proudly at their backyard garden. The picture was from a long ago, far than kind that smelled like sunscreen and sounded like sprinklers clicking in the distance. Back then, Daniel and his family lived just 3 houses away. He had been the boy who climbed trees faster than anyone else, who built forts out of cardboard, and who never minded getting caught in the rain. Emma remembered the afternoons when they'd ride bikes until sunset, racing down the quiet neighborhood streets while their laughter echoed between the houses. He'd always let her win, she knew it now, but back then, she thought she was just faster. One evening, when the sky turned orange and the fireflies began to glow, Daniel had told her something she never forgot. You know, he'd said, pushing his bike with one hand and holding a popsicle with the other, when you grow up, you're going to do something amazing. I just know it. She had laughed then, brushing it off like it was nothing. But sometimes, on quiet nights like this one, she could still hear his voice saying, it's steady, certain, like a promise she didn't know how to keep. Years passed, and life, as it always does, began to change. Daniel's family moved away for a few years when his father got a new job. Emma remembered standing at the edge of the driveway, watching the moving truck pull away. She'd waved, pretending she wasn't sad. But when the last car turned the corner, she went back to her room and sat by the window, staring at the empty street that suddenly felt too quiet. They reconnected years later, after college, when his family moved back to their old house. By then, both of them had changed, grown older, busier, a little quieter. Their conversations were polite, their smiles familiar, but measured still. There was something in the way Daniel always remembered small things about her. How she liked her tea with honey. How she used to hum when she worked on her art. How she never liked thunder, but always loved rain. And in return, Emma noticed him too. The way he leaned slightly when he laughed, the calm steadiness in his voice. The kind eyes that hadn't changed since childhood. It wasn't love then. Not exactly. It was something softer, something that lingered beneath the surface of their easy friendship. Now, years later, sitting alone in her quiet house, Emma realized how rare that kind of familiarity was. The kind that made you feel seen without having to explain yourself. She turned another page in the album. There they were again in teenagers this time, standing at a school fair. Daniel's arm was raised mid-wave, his face half hidden by laughter. She remembered that day so clearly. It was the year he'd transferred back, and everything had felt both old and new again. He'd walked into the school cafeteria one afternoon, saw her, and smiled like no time had passed at all. She had wanted to say something about how strange and good it felt to see him again. But words had failed her, so she just smiled back. Sometimes silence said more than speech ever could. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was another message from Daniel. "Daniel's still awake. Emma? Yeah. Couldn't sleep. The storm's too loud." The storm had calmed by morning. The world outside looked washed new, the streets shining with leftover rain. The air smelled like wet grass and quiet beginnings. Emma stood in the kitchen, stirring her tea, her thoughts still tangled with the night before. Daniel's visit had been simple tea, soft laughter, a few stories shared between candlelight and thunder. But it had left a strange warmth in her chest that refused to fade. She told herself it was just nostalgia, a harmless echo of old friendship. But as the day unfolded, she found herself replaying small moments. The way he'd smiled when she teased him, how he'd listened when she spoke, how natural it had felt to have him sitting across from her again sometimes. The smallest moments carried the heaviest meaning. She turned off the kettle and sighed. "Don't overthink it," she whispered to herself, though she knew that's exactly what she would do by afternoon. The sun had broken through the clouds, scattering light across the kitchen. Emma decided to step outside. The air was cool, the earth soft beneath her shoes. Across the street, Daniel was on his porch, repairing a loose section of the railing. He looked up, spotted her, and smiled the kind of smile that started in his eyes. "Morning," he called. "Morning," she replied, pretending to adjust her jacket so he wouldn't notice the flush that rose to her cheeks. He nodded toward her driveway. "Your car tires look a little low. Want me to check them later?" She laughed, still trying to fix everything in sight. "Old habits," he said. "Besides, you once told me I can't sit still." She tilted her head. "I did, didn't I?" It was such a small exchange, yet it felt like the world had paused around it. Later that day, Emma sat in her art room working on a new illustration. But the pencil wouldn't move the way she wanted it to. Every line she drew felt uncertain, restless. Her thoughts kept drifting toward the window, where sunlight filtered through the curtains. Without realizing it, she began sketching something. That wasn't part of her project, a small porch, a figure holding an umbrella. The faint suggestion of another figure in a doorway. When she finally looked down, she smiled at what she'd drawn. It was the scene from last night. Daniel standing in the rain, light from her window falling across the street. She stared at the drawing for a long moment, feeling a quiet ache she couldn't quite name. That's when her phone buzzed. "Daniel, you busy? Trying to draw? Why?" "Daniel, I think I accidentally borrowed something that's yours." "Emma." "Oh, Daniel, your favorite mug. I took it home by mistake last night. Want me to bring it over?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "The mug. She hadn't even noticed." Emma. "Sure. I'll trade you for some cookies I just baked." "Daniel, deal." When he arrived a few minutes later, the air between them felt different, not awkward, not overly familiar, just quietly charged with something real. He handed her the mug, still warm. "I made more tea. Thought you'd like a refill." "Thank you," she said, taking it from him. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," he replied simply. They sat on the front steps, side by side, watching the streets shimmer under the soft afternoon light. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was gentle, steady. Then Daniel said, "It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes people drift apart for years, and one storm brings them back together like no time passed." Emma looked at him, her fingers curling around the mug. "Yeah, maybe it's not strange at all. Maybe it's just life's way of reminding us we're not finished yet." He smiled, a little surprised. "You always did have the right words." She laughed quietly. "Only when I don't plan them." A breeze swept across the yard, carrying the smell of rain-soaked leaves. Daniel glanced toward her porch, where the candle from last night still sat by the window. "You kept it," he said softly. "It burned through the night," she replied. "I guess I didn't want to blow it out." Their eyes met again, and something in that moment shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just real. Like a truth finally allowed to breathe. He looked down, tracing the edge of his mug with a thumb. "Do you know, when I moved back, I thought about knocking on your door 100 times, just to say hi. But it never felt like the right moment." Emma tilted her head. "And now feels right," he said, voice quiet but certain. She smiled, a slow, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "Then I'm glad it rained." As the day faded into dusk, they lingered on the porch, sharing stories that bridged the years between them. They talked about the lives they'd built, the dreams they'd postponed, the small things that still mattered. Emma found herself laughing, generally laughing, and Daniel's eyes softened each time he heard the sound. When the first stars appeared, he stood, brushing off his jeans. "I should let you get back to your art." She rose too. "You know, I haven't drawn anything this personal in a long time." "Personal?" he asked. She smiled. "You'll see." He looked curious, but didn't press. "Then I'll look forward to it." As he walked back across the street, Emma stood there for a while, watching him disappear into his yard. The porch light flicked on behind him, just like last night. She turned back toward the house, her heart lighter, her mind restless in the best way. It wasn't the kind of twist you found in stories. It wasn't fate in the grand, dramatic sense. It was something quieter, more human. A forgotten connection rediscovered by accident, sparked by a storm and a borrowed mug. And for the first time in a long while, Emma felt something that wasn't loneliness or uncertainty. It was hope, the kind that glows softly in the dark, waiting for someone to notice. Part 4, the unspoken truth that evening. The house felt warmer than usual. Maybe it was the lingering sunlight through the curtains, or maybe it was something else, something quieter, something that had been missing for a long time and had suddenly returned. Emma sat at her desk, pencil in hand, staring at the unfinished sketch she had made earlier. The drawing of Daniel standing in the rain now seemed more alive than before. She added faint lines, the reflection of light on water, the subtle tilt of his head, details she remembered without trying to. Every stroke seemed to draw out something deeper, not just from her memory, but from her heart. When she finished, she leaned back and studied it. It wasn't perfect, but it felt honest. That was new for her. Outside, dusk gathered slowly, painting the sky in soft blues and purples. She heard a sound distant at first, then closer. A knock on the door. When she opened it, Daniel stood there again, holding a small plate covered with foil. "I baked something," he said with a modest shrug. My students gave me a recipe as a joke, but it didn't turn out terrible." Emma laughed. "You baked. Don't sound so surprised." "I'm just impressed." He grinned and held up the plate. "Want to be the brave one to test it?" She stepped aside. "Come in, chef." The room filled again with that quiet ease they had always shared. She poured tea while he set the plate down on the coffee table. Beneath the foil were slightly uneven slices of banana bread. "It smells good," she said. "Smells are deceptive," he replied. "Well then, I'll risk it." They sat across from each other, their laughter soft, easy. But as the conversation settled, silence slipped back into the room, not empty, but full of everything they weren't saying. Emma looked at him, really looked at him this time. His hair was a little messier than usual, his eyes calm but thoughtful. He always seemed steady, grounded, like someone who could hold the weight of the world without complaint. She wondered how long she had taken that for granted. "You still draw every day?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Most days," she said. "But lately, I've felt stuck." "Stuck how?" "Like I'm drawing, without really feeling it." "Until last night." He tilted his head. Last night? She smiled faintly. You and your flashlight inspired me, apparently. Daniel chuckled. If standing in the rain is what it takes, I'll keep the umbrella ready. She laughed softly, but then her expression grew thoughtful. You know, when I was younger, I used to think life would just unfold naturally, that everything would make sense one day. He nodded. And now? Now, I think some things never stop unfolding. They just keep waiting for you to notice them. Their eyes met across the candlelit table. It was one of those moments that didn't need sound, a quiet bridge between two people who had been circling the same truth for years. Daniel leaned back, resting his hands on his knees. You ever think about how we just drifted apart? Emma nodded slowly. All the time. It wasn't on purpose, he said. I know. She hesitated, then added, sometimes I think I was scared to reach out. You seemed like you had everything figured out. He gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. That's funny. I thought you did. For a long time, neither spoke. The sound of rain had faded to nothing, and the world outside the windows was still. Then Daniel said quietly, you were always the one who made things feel lighter. I didn't realize how much I missed that until last night. Emma felt her breath catch, not because of the words themselves, but because of the honesty behind them. She wanted to say something real, something she'd kept inside for years, but the words stayed trapped somewhere between her heart and her throat instead. She smiled gently and said, maybe we both needed the rain. The clock ticked softly in the background. Daniel stood, walking toward the window. The street was calm now, glistening under faint streetlights. He turned slightly, his voice lower. I should probably head home. I didn't mean to overstay. Emma rose too, her hand brushing the back. The morning after Daniel's visit was quiet, almost too quiet. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt washed in its echo. Emma moved through the house slowly, each sound amplified. The creak of the floor, the faint hum of the kettle, the rustle of pages as she flipped through her sketchbook. Last night had felt different, unfinished, somehow. She had gone to bed with a strange ache in her chest. Not of sadness, but of something stirring. Something finally waking after years of silence. She looked at the drawing she had made before she fell asleep, the two figures sitting side by side, close but not touching. The image seemed to whisper back to her now, as if asking, is this really how it ends? Emma sighed. She wasn't sure. Across the street, Daniel stood by his window, staring out at the same dull sky. He hadn't slept much either. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her the way she smiled last night. Soft and uncertain. And the way she said, maybe we both needed the rain. He had replayed that line in his mind a dozen times. Daniel wasn't someone who spoke easily about feelings. Years of teaching had trained him to listen more than he talked, to guide others instead of revealing himself. But something about seeing Emma again had broken through the walls he didn't even know he'd built. He reached for his jacket. Before he could talk himself out of it, Emma was in the middle of washing her paintbrushes. When she heard another knock, her heart gave a startled jump, not because she didn't know who it was, but because some part of her had been hoping it was him when she opened the door. Daniel stood there again, raincoat half-zipped, eyes uncertain. Hi, he said simply. Hi. He looked like he'd rehearsed something in his head and then forgotten all of it the moment he saw her. Can I talk to you for a minute? Emma nodded and stepped aside. Of course. The air between them felt charged, not tense, just full, like the world was holding its breath. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping near the window. I've been trying to figure out what last night meant, he began quietly. It felt different. I don't know if you felt it too. Emma's throat tightened, but she managed to nod. I did. He took a slow breath. I realized something. Emma, we keep talking around everything, pretending it's fine, pretending the years didn't matter. But they did. At least, they did to me. She stayed still, her heart thudding in her chest. Daniel looked down at his hands, his voice softer now. You were always more than just a friend. Even when we drifted apart, I carried pieces of you with me. Every time I saw something beautiful or something simple that felt right, you'd come to mind. And I never said anything because I thought it was too late." Emma's eyes shimmered, but she didn't speak. He continued, words coming slowly but with a quiet force. "I guess I came here today because I don't want to keep pretending. I don't expect anything to change. I just needed you to know." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was fragile, sacred. The kind of silence where truth lives. Emma finally exhaled, her voice trembling but steady. "You think you're the only one who pretended?" Daniel looked up, surprised. "I used to tell myself I was fine," she said. "That people grow apart, that memories fade. But they didn't. I painted you into so many of my sketches without even realizing it. You were always there, in the corners of my work, hidden in the lines, I guess. I never really stopped missing you. For a long time, neither moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock." Then, almost without thinking, Daniel stepped closer. Not too close, just enough that she could feel his presence, steady and real. "Maybe we were both waiting," he said softly. "For the right time. For the courage to say it." Emma smiled faintly. "And maybe that time is now." They stood in the quiet years of unspoken words, finally resting in the open air between them. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't need to be. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping music, just two people finally speaking the truth. They had carried too long. Daniel's shoulders relaxed as if a weight had lifted. Emma looked lighter too, her eyes clear, her smile unguarded. After a moment, she said, "Do you want some tea?" He laughed softly, the tension melting away. "Only if it comes with banana bread." She rolled her eyes playfully. "I make no promises." They moved to the kitchen together, the ordinary act feeling extraordinary somehow. As the kettle began to hum, Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her pour water into the cups. "It's strange," he said, "how something so small, one conversation, one visit, can change everything." Emma nodded, looking up at him. "Maybe it doesn't change everything. Maybe it just reminds us what still matters." Sighed. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden glow across the table. Emma smiled at the sight, feeling warmth spread through her chest, not the restless kind that came with longing, but the gentle kind that came with peace. Daniel raised his cup slightly, a quiet toast to truth. She clinked hers softly against his. 2 second chances. They both smiled, not because they knew what the future would hold, but because for the first time in years they weren't afraid of it. That evening, as the light faded and laughter filled the kitchen once again, Emma realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes the turning point isn't a grand revelation or a perfect moment. Sometimes it's just two people finally brave enough to stop hiding. The next few days felt like waking up from a long, quiet dream. The storm had passed, so had the years of silence that once lingered between Emma and Daniel. Life didn't suddenly change overnight. There were still the same early mornings, the same streetlights flickering outside, the same teapot whistling in the kitchen. But somehow, everything seemed softer now. The world felt lighter, as though the air itself carried forgiveness. Daniel still came by, sometimes always, with some excuse that made Emma laugh. "Forgot my umbrella last time," or "thought I saw your mailbox leaning." But they both knew he wasn't there for mail or weather. He was there because something inside him had finally found its place again. And for Emma, each visit was like a quiet note in a song she'd almost forgotten the melody to. The kind of song you don't need to sing out loud to feel. One afternoon, as the late autumn sun stretched through the curtains, Emma sat by her easel sketching again. Her hand moved freely now, no hesitation, no doubt. Each line felt like a breath released, like the art itself was healing something within her. When the doorbell rang, she didn't even have to ask who it was. Daniel stood there holding 2 paper cups of coffee, one in each hand, with that same awkward smile that had started to look a lot like home. "Peace offering," he said. "I may or may not have borrowed your favorite pen last time." She raised an eyebrow, amused. You mean the one you said you'd return 2 days ago? Exactly that one, he said, grinning. I'm early, technically. They laughed, and she stepped aside to let him in. They talked about simple things again, how fast the seasons were changing, how her brother's plants were somehow still alive, how the whole neighborhood seemed quieter lately. There was a comfort in the ordinary. They didn't need to fill every silence anymore. The pauses between words felt natural, peaceful, like the calm that follows a storm when the world just breathes. After a while, Daniel looked around and noticed the new sketch on her easel. It showed a small house under soft rain with two figures sitting by a window. One of them held a candle. It's beautiful, he said quietly. Is it about that night? Emma smiled faintly. Maybe, or maybe it's just about what happens when the world slows down long enough to let people listen. He nodded, understanding more than her words could say. A gentle breeze drifted through the window, carrying the faint scent of rain on pavement. It felt like déjà vu, like the world was softly replaying the night that had brought them together again. Funny, Daniel said, his voice thoughtful. That storm. I used to think it was just bad weather. But now I think it was something else, like the universe trying to make us stop running. Emma looked at him, eyes warm. And maybe we finally listened. There was a silence, then deep, unhurried, and full of meaning. Neither needed to say what came next. The truth had already been spoken, and now it simply existed between them. Steady and sure. As evening came, Daniel stood to leave. The light from the window painted gold along his shoulders. I should get going, he said gently. They say another storm might roll in tonight. Emma smiled softly. Then you better keep that umbrella this time, he chuckled. Or maybe I'll forget it again on purpose. She tilted her head. You wouldn't dare. He grinned, and for a moment it was like the years melted away entirely. Just a friends, maybe more than friends, standing in the kind of peace that only honesty could bring. Before stepping out, he paused at the doorway. Emma, thank you. For what? For not closing the door that night? Her voice was gentle. Thank you for knocking. The next day, the rain did come, but not in thunder this time. It was soft and steady, a rhythm that filled the air without hurry. Emma stood at the window again, watching the drops race down the glass across the street. Daniel was there, holding his umbrella high. Waving just once before heading down the road, she waved back, smiling. Something inside her told her this wasn't the end of their story, just a pause. A quiet chapter between what had been and what would come next. Not every love needs a grand declaration. Sometimes love is simply knowing that someone will keep showing up, even when the rain returns. That nig.